everyone. I am here because Jen and Jonas asked me to say a few words at the beginning, but I won't take too much of your time. I'll be fairly brisk because there's really fun both speakers today, as well as just like this is the first in the series that Jonas and Jen have put together about mentorship and sharing. So it's a really fun kickoff. What I will do, so Andreas, do you want to go to the next slide? I know you're wrangling the slides today.
Yeah.
So welcome. I lead Cohere for AI. So Cohere for AI is a nonprofit research lab that's both focused on making progress on important machine learning questions. We work on curiosity-driven research, as well as creating more points of entry into machine learning. And if we go to the next slide, I think this will give a sense of what our goals are. It's to change how, where, and by whom research is done. And this is both by exploring progress and important ML problems, but also by showing that good research can be done anywhere. And in the next slide, really what you're seeing now is like some of our core programs. So this is a community-led event, and it's also one of, a seminar series. So this is really such a cool event. There's also the research programs. And we are just getting started. We're a baby lab. So we started a few months ago and we're a baby community. So Andreas, if you go to the next slide. Yeah, so today is super special because of that. I think it's so exciting, and especially with the community. For me, it's just so important that the community is a space where we can throw events like this. So starting the journey of changing how we collaborate and building new spaces. And one of it's just emphasizing cross-institutional collaboration, but it's also providing a space for researchers both with and without formal affiliations, and providing entry points into machine learning research. So if we go to the next slide. Okay, excellent. So this is where I'll do my handoff and I'll put the spotlight where it belongs. So this is a series that's been put together by both Jen, Jonas, and Madeline has done an amazing job making this event come to life. But this is one of the two series that have come out of the community right now. And that for me is really cool because it's a chance for us to shape programming as we go. So I will pass along to Jen. I believe I'll pass to you. Okay, excellent. Got a subtle nod. And just have fun, enjoy the event. Feel free to join our community. You can reach out to Madeline afterwards or apply directly on our website. But really excited to have Andreas here because Andreas, I believe is, well, actually, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to pass to Jen, who I presume will give you a sampler of what's about to unfold, but thanks so much.
Andreas, if we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Hi, so my name is Jen. I'm a second-year PhD student in Austria and a member of the Cohere for AI community. And along with Jonas, we are leading an interactive speaker series with the goal of kind of increasing access to research to people who maybe are outside of a formal program like a PhD. And because our community is just getting started, we thought a great way to kick it off is to have a bunch of talks from invited experts on AI, but also just on independent and collaborative research, such as this event, and also to open it to the larger community. And in addition, specifically for the C4AI community, we also will have opportunities to actually talk to our speakers and get some feedback about research ideas, some channels for informal mentorship. And longer term, we really want to support the formation of independent research project teams within the Cohere for AI community. And we're really excited to kick this off. I think we have an amazing first speaker, and we'll have events about once a month going forward. And with that, I'll pass it on to Jonas to introduce Andreas.
Awesome. Thank you, Jen. We are very honored today to have Andreas as our first speaker. This is like the first event. And so thank you for everyone who's also joining us today. Andreas is a PhD candidate at Miller currently. He's researching interpretability and for NLP. Primarily, he's interested in focusing on ensuring interpretability methods and to provide valid explanations And today he will be discussing some lessons that he has on independent researching and open questions in interpretability. So if you would like, and if you have questions while he's speaking, you can prepare some questions, and or if you have some comments, also we will have a Q&A session later on. So feel free to get them ready. So I would like to pass it on to Andreas.
Thank you. Yes, so my name is Andreas, and thanks a lot for the introduction. If I had known this would be the inaugural talk, maybe I wouldn't have accepted, but I just learned this. So I was an independent researcher in interpretability. I still work in interpretability, but as mentioned, I'm now a PhD candidate in Miller. And so I thought it would be useful to talk about my journey, to have sort of a 20-minute narrative about that and what I learned. And then after that, we'll go into sort of the general themes and specific ideas of where you might want to work in interpretability. And I should preface this by saying I mostly work in NLP interpretability. And so the parts about that is mostly going to be about NLP interpretability. So my journey, at least with regard to machine learning, started in 2011. I read this book, Collective Intelligence, and then I read it again, and then a third time. And about the end of the third time, I decided that I was going to do machine learning, although it wasn't really the popular word at the time. And so in 2012, I decided to go to study applied mathematics for my bachelor. Well, it looks like this, or like this, if you prefer cakes. And I finished that in 2015. And I knew I was going to do the master. That's like the default in Denmark. But in between that, I had a little summer job. And this is kind of my big moment for explanation. And so this job was to make a prototype for a search engine. So you put in your job description, and out comes through the magic of the search engine comes these resumes. And there's many sources of bias here. I was aware of this. However, something interesting happened. So we were collaborating with this external headhunting company. And so we were presenting these different resumes, and then they were saying, okay, what is great about them, what is bad about them, and learning through that process. And one day we were presenting a resume, and this headhunter here, they said, oh, I really like this one. Why? Because of the gender. And you might not be surprised about this, but this is very illegal in Denmark. And so one thing is to be biased, another thing is to flat out admit it. And obviously they were a problem, but a problem for me was that they would eventually become part of a feedback loop where they would interact with the search algorithm directly, and it will learn from what they like. And so now we have a biased feedback loop, and there are many ways to disaster, but this is a very, very quick way of getting there. And so this was bothering me, it was bothering everybody. And we didn't really know how to solve it. We didn't even have the feedback loop implemented, so it wasn't really the highest priority at the time. It was just 2 months, this job here for me, but I kept thinking about this. How was I gonna solve this? I thought about it for years, and eventually I kind of realized that even given the most virtuous model, a shining beacon of light, the hopes to all mankind, unbiased in all aspects, there's just nothing that prevents a human from filling according to their own bias. So they can just go through the search results, pick out the gender they like, and that's kind of the end of that. The model really doesn't matter that much. And so when I hit a wall like this is when I tend to find the most inspiration. And so the first lesson here, you should always draw the humans in these kind of graphs. So let's do that. Then I thought about, well, if this virtuous model doesn't really solve anything, then what about the sexist model? Can that solve something? And And what you can actually do is you could explain it, right? So the recruiter is represented by some parameters in the model. And so if we can explain those parameters in the model, we're essentially explaining the recruiter. And so we could go back to the recruiter and say, well, these are your biases. You should rethink your thought process. And this is kind of like a first step to a real improvement. Not saying there isn't a room for virtuous models or ethical models. You should absolutely deploy those, but in terms of the explanation, there's some real value here that you won't find anywhere else. This is interesting because usually I will say that explanation, they will never solve the bias issue. They can lead to discovery, and discovery can lead to change. And so in this case, well, explaining this to the recruiter doesn't necessarily make them change the thought process, right? Like that has to be something that comes from the discovery, and that has to be their own decision. But it is the first step. There are other motivations for interpretability. This is kind of the painting I like to draw. We have the sort of the category of scientific understanding and model debugging. This is very popular in the industry because it leads to profit. And you shouldn't be ashamed of working in that direction. Actually, many of the methods which applies to that category of motivation also applies to the other category, which is about ethics, accountability, safety. And, I'm not going to really explain what these terms means because they are abstract. Hopefully through this example that I just talked about with the recruiter, maybe you get some idea. And so in 2017, I finished my master, and for context, in Denmark, you don't really do internships and you don't really do publications. You just study. But in 2017 as well, I then started becoming a freelancer in data analysis, data visualization, statistics, machine learning, things like that. And this was great, although as a freelancer, you don't really get to work on very ambitious things because clients, they don't want to pay for risk. They want to make sure they get what they pay for. And so when you sort of have these discussions with your clients, it ends up becoming very scikit-learn solutions, simple statistical models, things that you know can work. And I like to work in the unknown. I like not knowing that there is a solution. And so I was never quite satisfied with this. And I knew that to really work on sort of ambitious things where I didn't know if there was a solution, I had to demonstrate that I could work in that kind of uncertainty, right? Which typically you would do for publications. And so I ended up writing this distilled publication, although it was quite a journey to that, happened in 2019. And if you read the affiliations, it's going to say near form limited, because I actually managed to get paid to do this publication. But it is independent research. There are no other authors than this. And so you might ask, well, that is crazy. Like, how did you manage to get paid to do this? And the answer is you don't. The conversation was that they were an outsourcing company, and they wanted to establish themselves as a machine learning capable company. Many outsourcing companies wanted this. And my argument was, well, if you want to demonstrate that you can do machine learning, you should do it in the public. And what better stamp of approval than to actually get like a peer-reviewed publication? However, you don't like risk. And there's a lot of risk in getting published. And so a zero risk solution here is that we just make a blog post. And so in fact, there does exist a blog post very similar to this article, and it did bring them a new source of clients. And so from that perspective, that was a total success, irrespective of whether or not it got published. And then I worked on making sure this got published afterwards. I wasn't paid for that. But most of the work I had financed. And so there's some important lessons here, which is there's no such thing as a total failure. Like, there might be a total failure, but if there is, you're working on the wrong thing. You need to plan for these kind of intermediate successes. So in this case, writing the blog post, that was the intermediate success, right? That was what prevented the total failure. The other lessons is you should apply your strengths. So in my case, I was quite great at like data visualization, web development, communication, and these were sort of the core strengths I needed for this publication. And because of this, I didn't have to do fancy model development. I could just take some simple LSTM models. They would train like an hour on a GPU, and that was kind of it. So it also required very few resources. And so you have to shape your independent research ideas around your strengths and using few resources. And so the journey for this took about a year. I started the work in March 2018. And then I got rejected again, and then rejected a third time. These are editorial rejects, which is something you can do with a journal. So they would just have an editor read it and then reject it. They did give some feedback, although not a ton. And eventually they decided that this was worthy of going to peer review. So I got my reviews and I started incorporating the feedback I got for that. And then March next year, I got published. And so this is, I think, pretty fast for journal publication. I just did another one that took like 2 years, but it was very valuable for me. And so the lessons here is that you will get rejected and it will hurt. There's still value in trying. The publication I did after this, I would not have been able to do if I hadn't had the opportunity to get rejected this many times in such a short span of time. And getting rejected hurts, so you need to have a support network. No one can struggle alone and be productive, is what I tend to say. Your support network does not have to be fellow researchers who is also trying to get published. It can also just be somebody who have ambitions in life and are struggling with that. Before this, I'd mostly done experimental reports, which is I learned was quite a different writing style. For papers, readers really don't care about the details. What are your learning rates? What is your learning curve? How did you split the data set? Stuff like that. They don't care. They should care, and it should belong in the appendix, although typically you won't even find it there. Another lesson I learned was that good enough is not good enough. Your reviewers might not find every mistake that you make, but they will find a mistake if it's there. And one mistake can be enough to be rejected. And so whenever you think, or whenever I thought, this is good enough, then that is really a moment for me to catch myself and think, okay, how can I improve this? Is there some assumption I can find, something in the appendix I can write? Can I cite a paper that's going to clarify this? And the last thing I learned here is what I now like to call defensive writing, which is there's going to be like 1 or 2 messages that a reviewer, that is just critical to understand the paper, but a reviewer might miss them or forget them, not understand that they're critical. And so I kind of learned to just litter these messages throughout the entire paper, repeat them again and again. And in my technical writing, I usually wouldn't repeat a message like that, but in paper writing where you might have a lazy reviewer, it is quite necessary, I think. And so while finishing this paper, I had done freelancing for a long time. I wanted some vacation, so I went to Japan. This is me finishing the paper. And also went there because I was getting really tired of the competitiveness of the European and North American markets. I wanted to know if I could work somewhere else. That was me at a job conference, not for machine learning, but nonetheless useful information. And it was also an opportunity for me to sort of get lost and forget a bit about machine learning, but wondering about, was I gonna get home from this place out of nowhere? And well, when I did get home to Denmark, what would I do? And I kind of thought, well, this still publication was not gonna be the last one. And I think this was important for me to take some time to really like crystallize that thought for me, because the next publication was a lot more difficult to write. Without that sort of clarity of mind that I got by just taking some time off from it, I don't think I would have been able to really complete that. That doesn't mean that like you absolutely have to commit. It's okay to say this is too much for me, I want to stop. But I think you should take your time to really think about whether or not this is what you want to do. Another thing I learned was that you need publications to get to nice labs. 1 to 2 publications in top NLP venues was the message I got. My distill publication and industry experience wasn't really enough. And so this kind of settled it. This still was not going to be the end. And I started collaborating with this fellow called Alexander. And so Alexander was a research assistant at the university where I studied, the Technical University of Denmark. And as a research assistant, he was part of teaching classes, and they were trying to reproduce this paper. And nobody could reproduce this. It's a quite simple paper. And so that's kind of strange. He had other ideas for what we could work on, but I thought this was interesting because it applied to my strengths. It was very mathematical. I studied applied mathematics. It required a few resources because it was just these 100 neural networks. So I could train it like in an hour on a CPU. Background research takes a lot of time, and this was basically the only paper you needed to know. And so that really made that part a lot easier. And the last part is that this was a talk, I think, at NeuroIPS 2018. So there was a lot of interest in this, but nobody really managed to do anything with it. And so I thought it was also a great branding opportunity. And you should not be ashamed to think about branding, because as an independent researcher, I assume your goal is to not continue as an independent researcher. It's quite stressful. And so you should try and get the most out of the effort that you put in, which means if you want to work in an area that nobody cares about, you should probably not do that. Maybe you can do it later in life, but independent research, this might not be the time. So our collaboration went like this. We met for 1 to 2 hours per week. Was a kind of classical split where I did most of the work. I presented the background in order to understand the challenges, and then we worked on the problems together. We thought about what kind of assumptions we are making, how can we test them, how can we like split up the problem, try to understand all the components. And then I would write down the actionables, what I would do for the week. And that was kind of how it went. Then I would come back with the results, present the background challenges, and on it repeats. And I think this separates a bit from how I see PhD students interact with their supervisors. Usually they just present the results, and that's kind of it. So I would encourage you not to do that. Focus on what are the actual problems you want to talk about. And an important lesson here for all researchers, independent or not, is to write down the assumptions and test them. This is extremely obvious. How actually doing it is very difficult. And I think as an independent researcher, you're going to be in a much better position to learn this skill. It will be much harder in the beginning, because what I kind of see is that the supervisor like a professor would take over this role, they're gonna do a lot of the assumption fighting, think about how to test them if they're maybe a good professor. As an independent researcher, you don't have that kind of support, but you will be in a much better position to learn this. And so try to always think about, like, is there some kind of assumption here, and how would I test it? Some other lessons I learned were that you can break the rules. So one rule I really insisted on breaking here was that we were going to sort of deconstruct the previous paper and think about, to explain why it didn't work and how we would fix this, and then therefore, why would our method work? And typically you don't see this in papers. What we could have done instead was just to present sort of the American fairy tale of these are our method and this is how great our results is. So that has like a much more positive tone. And we did get smacked for this by the reviewers. But I also think ultimately this is what led to the Spotlight Award. Don't know this, but that's my assumption. Because what we kind of seen in papers after this is that they kind of adopted this kind of writing style. And so it's sort of become its own little microclimate of papers which are much more critical than usual. Then the next part is that you want to collaborate with somebody who's engaged. I think many independent researchers who write to me, they say, talk about working with a professor or something like that. Your professor is going to have hundreds of papers already published. They don't need another one. Working with somebody who's actually engaged, like Alexander was in a similar situation as me, he needed a breakthrough too, I think was much more useful. And the last part is that I couldn't really think about the intermediate successes for this. So instead I thought about diversity. I worked in other side projects. I tried to publish an open source module that would make the visualization I had for my distill paper, for example. And I did go rejected from NeurIPS, and that hurt a lot. That's my artistic pause. And I can't really prepare you for that. All I can say is that you are not alone. We did manage to do a workshop publication, which is something I hadn't really thought about, but this was, we good? Okay. But this was a intermediate success, and I think a very valuable one because I actually did get contacted by a professor about becoming a research assistant just because of this workshop publication. And so I think usually if you talk to professors, they're kind of discouraging workshop publications, but they're actually very valuable and not that difficult to make. So you can think about that. Okay, so this also meant that I did go to NeurIPS in 2019 because of the workshop publication. This cost a fortune if you were an independent researcher. Fortunately for me, I had earned quite a lot that year in as a freelancer, and so I could deduct this in tax. Still cost a fortune though. You don't typically get any sponsorships, and you have to pay the full industry price as an independent researcher. The one thing I want to change here, it is that, but I don't have the power. This was really valuable for me. I had this moment here where I saw Bien Kem do a talk on interpretability. And until this exact moment, I did not know the word interpretability. If you read the distilled publication, I'm trying to invent all sorts of other words in order to describe the same thing. But all the professors I talked about explanations, they were saying, oh, you shouldn't work in this area. You should work on Bayesian optimization. That's the way forward. And so they were quite discouraging. And I never really needed external support. But at this moment here, I understood that you could become a researcher in interpretability. And I went home and I read almost every paper that Bien Kem has written. And after that, my mind was clear that interpretability was something I wanted to do. Which is funny because everything I'd done until then was in interpretability, but I just didn't understand that at the time. And I never really needed role models in my life, but if I did need one, this would be the case. And so Bien Kim did do a talk recently, a keynote at iClear, where she covers the high-level aspects of interpretability. And so if you're interested in this, you should 100% watch this. She does a much greater job than I could ever do. But that's okay, because she needs to think about the high-level aspects of interpretability. I do not. And so if you ever think about the imposter syndromes and things like that, then also think about how your values might differ. You'd have different resources, you have different needs at the time. And so these kind of comparisons really are not valid. So with that is a great chance to go to the second act here, which is about the general themes and some specific ideas. And so just to be very clear, interpretability is the ability to explain and to present in understandable terms to human. Typically, it's the model that we like to explain, but it could also be the data set. It could also be another human. There are many choices. And so typically you have your model. This is where 99.9% of the grant money in the research goes into. The rest of the grant money goes to explanations. And then we also have evaluations, which is how good are these explanations. And these three aspects are typically researched very separately. In particular, evaluation is very separate. It's about, is it useful to humans? Do humans find this valuable? And does the explanation reflect the model? But I would encourage you, I should say, like, these are very useful things to work on. I work on this, and the current research is not that great, although it's really increasing. I think there's still a lot to be done. But I would encourage you to think about these things, how we can combine them. So a classical thing to think about is, how can I make a model that is easy to explain? However, what typically happens here is we come up with a very specific model, which is really great at a very specific task. And that is great academic research, but I promise you, they're never going to be adopted in the industry. The industry is not going to have exactly those specific problems or specific tasks. And so they're going to look for general purpose models, and the explanations are just not a priority. And so I would encourage you to instead think about, how can I make really great explanations for one particular general purpose model, like the BERT model, for example, instead. Another way you can think about this is, what kind of explanations can I make which are easy to evaluate? Another kind of explanation you could think about is, or not kind of research you could think about is, how can I optimize the model with respect to the evaluation? We good, Stephen? Okay, so these are two general themes, and I have also written a survey paper for you, and this really is for you, in the sense that this is the kind of survey paper I wanted to read when I started. It goes through all of the different ways that you can communicate an explanation. So each row here is an explanation, or a way to communicate. So for example, input features is, these words are important for making a prediction. Adversarial examples is, you could change this word to this word and that will break the model, things like that. And there's one particular area here called class explanations. So local explanations try to explain a prediction or a single observation. Global explanations, they try to explain the entire model. But in between that, there's class explanations, where you try and explain an entire class. And as you can see, there's not a lot of work being done here, but I think it's a really great compromise between these two levels of being very concrete or being very abstract. And so, for example, we have concepts. I think this was first shown by Bien Cam. In computer vision, it can be, are these stripes important for the classification of a stepper, or natural language processing? It might be that is an occupation important for predicting this pronoun. But you don't have to think about concepts. You could come up with a completely different way of communicating, and I think that would be amazing. Another direction is because a lot of the work done in interpretability happens. Just the lawnmower, okay. Another, thank you. Another source of that kind of okay, I'm good. A lot of the work done in interpretability is in computer vision, and computer vision is classification. And I think this is because images are better or easier to visualize, so it's a bit easier to sell papers in computer vision. However, when those methods are then adapted to NLP, they're also about classification, right? But we have a completely different category of models in NLP about sequential outputs, or sequence-to-sequence models. And so these tends to not really be explained, not that much research on this. And so you can think about how can these explanations be visualized, what parts of the output should we consider, are there new ways of communicating? And I think this is very relevant now that these big models like GPT models or something like that, like they're all sequence-to-sequence models, right? And they need to be explained, but there's not really any work on this. And so these are the 4 general themes I would encourage you to think about. But I also have specifics for you. And so in the survey, for each way of communicating, go through how does that look like? What is sort of the general definition here, but also what are the specific methods which might do this? How do they look like? And then finally, what is future works that you might want to do here? So for adversarial examples, which is about, can I replace this word with this word? Is that going to break the model? There's a lot of different permutations to consider. The search space is way too big. And so how can we restrict the search space in order to look for explanations which are more in line with what we're actually interested in? For example, is the gender of this paragraph important? So that could be one research direction. And so each row or each chapter discusses sort of the very specifics of what you might want to work on here. And so with that, I think we'll move on to the panel discussions or Q&A.
Awesome. Well, Andreas, that was a fantastic talk. Thank you. So we'll go to the Q&A session, and perhaps maybe we can start with people who want to ask directly. So if you have a question.
Sure.
Yeah.
The hard-hitting questions.
I can jump in with a quick question.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Andreas. That was a great presentation. What's your sense on what's the state of the art in NLP explanation? Let's say either for classification or because for generation, it's a nascent research area for generative models, but on the classification side, would it be something like TCAV, or what's the top of the list in your mind, do you think?
It's really not the right question to ask, I think, because you want to think about how do you communicate, right? So within each way of communicating to somebody, there's different state of the arts. I think maybe for input features, the state of the art would probably be sharp methods, but they're also terribly expensive to compute. For adversarial examples, probably like hot flip here might be the best. Influential examples, I might say representative pointer selections It's an incredibly simple method, but somehow it ends up working really well almost all of the time. Counterfactual explanation mice is a good method. Polyjuice, I'm sorry to say, is really not worth that much. Natural language explanations, all methods are terrible. There's no state of the art. If you want to work on that, I would encourage you just be very skeptical of what you read. Yeah, I don't know if I have much to say for the others. I think for linguistic information, it's also a field that you should be really, really skeptical of. There's only one good paper in this field, which is about information theoretic probing. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Awesome. Do we have any other question from the participants?
Hi, Andreas.
Yeah, hi.
Hi. Thanks for the talk. You mentioned a point about we should think about branding and if the paper is getting a lot of interest.
Sure.
So, like, how do you decide if that paper has like a lot of interest? Is it the number of citations, or is it like the big names in the paper, like DeepMind, Google Brain, like?
Maybe I wouldn't look at it like big names, because you're not going to be a big name. So
Yeah.
so correlating with that is not useful. But I would look at, for example, at how much are like papers cited by others who are maybe not famous researchers, right? And so like Andrew Trask at the time was not a famous researcher, but I think after this he got a research position at DeepMind. Although I guess some of the co-authors were quite known.
Okay.
I'm just gonna let the organizers manage the chat, right?
Awesome, yes. Yes, so there is a question that is about collaboration. I guess I'm also curious about. So you mentioned that you collaborate with one of the professors, but they were at your university. So
research assistant.
Research assistant, yes. I guess you were in the same institution. But
yeah, that's true.
The question here is, what are the good places to find collaborations or to find engaged collaborators?
Well, I managed to actually get in contact with Alexander by just going to like a local event for machine learning. And so, I mean, that would be a good place to start, I think. You could also look like who are the first authors of a paper you might like. Maybe those could be people to collaborate with. Yeah.
Great. Ander, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that name right. Ander was wondering, how do you apply your strengths if you haven't found them yet?
Okay. Andrew, I understand perfectly. I think this is more of an internal search question. Like, I'm sure you have strengths. Like, that is not the question. Just you might be looking at other researchers and you see the kind of work that they do and you think those are not my strengths, and that might be true. But if you, for example, think about the distilled publication, right? Like, that is a completely different set of strengths that I use than a typical researcher would use, right? And so you can do research with alternative sets of strengths that you have. And in fact, I would argue that you're able to do much more novel research by doing that.
Right. One more thing that I think one of the participants is asking is about, I guess, credibility. So he says maybe you could talk about common rejections and weaknesses that you faced, maybe in peer review. What are the common criticism of your work and how has that changed over time? I guess this is more a question of, as an independent researcher, how can you have credibility, right?
Something I had a hobby of doing was to read peer reviews from iClear, because those are public, and you can actually also read how the authors responded to that. And you can even read rejected papers. I like to read rejected papers and the peer reviews there. I think you can learn a lot from that. I think one thing I really learned was ablacency studies. This was something that became very important for the iClear paper I did. And so I think we ended up writing like almost a 20-page appendix just on ablacency studies. And so, yeah, that was definitely something I learned there.
Awesome. So if there's no other question, I would say that would be a wrap.
Yeah, can we go to the second to last slide in the presentation so I can close this up?
Yeah,
This
that's
one?
passing it to you.
No, all the way, all the way.
Oh, okay.
Yes, that one. Great. One more. Yes. All right. So Andreas, thank you so much for the wonderful talk. Thank you to everybody for attending. Can we actually have like a round of applause for Andreas?
Thank you.
I know we're all on mute, but maybe we're showing up on camera.
Yes, I see it.
I wanted to really quick mention that next month, at a time that we will announce, including on Twitter, we'll follow up on this theme with an independent research panel that'll also look at a little bit of NLP, rare languages, and things like that. So please stay tuned for that. And now for the general members, thank you very much for attending.